A very good afternoon to everyone who has joined us today. I welcome you all to our second talk of Think Again Live with none other than Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao himself. The world was taken by surprise when a giant like Lehman Brothers collapsed on 15 September 2008. The then governor of the Federal Reserve of the United States, Ben Bernanke, said that September and October 2008 probably witnessed the worst financial crisis in global history, including the Great Depression of 1929. India, a developing economy and an emerging market, needed to take careful measures to lessen the effect of its crisis on its economy, while also trying to maintain the high level of growth it had been experiencing for the past few years. This mammoth challenge stood before Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao, a former lead economist at World Bank and a very reputed Indian Administrative Service officer who had just begun his journey as the governor of the RBI after being the finance secretary in the government of India for the past year. A man no stranger to turning fiscal fortunes, as he had already proved in Andhra Pradesh earlier in his career, having contributed to their financial turnaround in the late 90s after the state had slipped into an unprecedented fiscal crisis. Thanks to his decades of experience in leadership positions, despite being very new to the environment at RBI, he was able to lead India's economy to safety amidst the global crisis. There is perhaps no better person to discuss and share what being a leader truly means and what leadership during a crisis entails. A physics student at the Indian Institute of Technology, All India Rank 1 in UPSC Civil Service Examination, a reputed civil servant, former finance secretary, former lead economist at the World Bank, former governor of the RBI, an author, and currently a distinguished visiting professor at the National University of Singapore. Sharing with us the leadership lessons he learned the hard way, we have Dr. Duvvuri Subbarao. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Srijan, and good afternoon to everyone. I know what you're all thinking right now. You're looking at me and making an evaluation, making an assessment of this guy, joined the IAS, became the finance secretary, worked in the World Bank, became governor. What's he going to tell us? Actually, this is what we all do. When we look at a stranger, in the first 30 seconds, we make an assessment of that person. I learned this the hard way because leaders have to judge people. And oftentimes, first impressions are misleading. Let me tell you a story. I joined the IAS in 1972. In a few months, it's going to be 50 years since I joined the IAS. And you all know that there's an interview after you pass the written exam before you qualify for the IAS. So I was called for the interview. I think it was sometime in late February or early March in 1972. I was still studying in IIT Kanpur at that time. My interview was the first one slot at 9 o'clock in the morning. So I took an overnight train from Kanpur to Delhi. I arrived in Delhi around 5 o'clock in the morning, went to my friend's house. I had a shower and changed. I pressed my suit, wore it, and my friend's mother gave me breakfast. After that, I had to go to UPSC. And my father, who was a low-paid government servant in Andhra Pradesh, insisted that I take a taxi. And I was telling him I never took a taxi, I'll take the bus. But he was very, very particular that I must take a taxi. So I took a taxi. First time I ever sat in a taxi, first time I ever wore a suit. Went to UPSC, I was there by 8:40. My interview was at 9. So by about 9:10, I was ushered into the room. So the chairman asked me, are you still at IIT Kanpur? Yes, sir. When did you come from Kanpur? This morning, sir. Came by train? Yes, sir. Then he looked at another member. The other member said, Mr. Subbarao, do you read newspapers? Yes, sir. Regularly? Fairly regularly, sir. What newspaper do you read? The Statesman. Okay, tell me, did you look at this morning's newspaper? I was flustered. And the chairman understood my discomfort. And then he looked at the member and said, look, it's winter, 9 o'clock in the morning. You didn't look at this morning's paper. Why do you ask him? So the other member said, all right, if you're not looked at today's paper, that's okay. Do you remember yesterday's paper? I said, yes, sir. So what was the picture on the front page? of the Statesman yesterday. Fortunately, I remember. These days, I don't remember what was in the previous day's paper, much less even in today's paper. But I said, sir, it was the picture of Muslims celebrating Muharram. He said, celebrating? I was flustered once again. He said, is Muharram a festival to celebrate? Then I was, flustered. My face was becoming ashen. Then he said, Muharram is not a festival. Muharram is an occasion for mourning or for a prophet who died. I said, yes, sir, thank you. Then he said, tell me, which sect of Muslims observes Muharram? And the chairman looked at him and said, he doesn't even know what Muharram is. Why do you ask him which sect of Muslims observes Muharram? So by this time, this conversation took about a minute. I was completely devastated. Now, what impression are these interview members going to make of me? But over the next 40 minutes, my interview went to a very high level. We talked about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. We talked about existentialism. We talked about center-state politics in India, a lot of things. Actually, my interview went to a very high level. The reason I'm telling you this is that people make first impressions in the first half minute, just as you must have made an impression of me. Actually, when I was in the World Bank, I once went for a one-week training program. That training program, it was on leadership. There were about 25 people. All of us were strangers to each other. We gathered there in some mountain resort around Washington, D.C. On Monday morning, the first session, 25 of us, we were divided into 5 subgroups of 5 people each. We were all sent to different rooms. And there was a coordinator there. She said some topics she gave us. We were not even introduced to each other. Even before we broke ice, she gave a topic and said, why don't you people discuss this for the next half an hour? Something like, imagine you to talk about, should the government reduce the fuel taxes? Or why is the crime against women on the increase? Some topic like that, talk about it for half an hour. So we talked about that topic for half an hour, even before we were actually introduced to each other. At the end of half an hour, of course, we introduced ourselves. That's what the coordinator said. And before the session broke up, the coordinator told us, all of you take a piece of paper, write down your first impressions of all the other 4 people on that paper. She also said, for our comfort, that I'm not going to ask you what you've written about them. I'm not going to ask you to reveal it to other members. This is just for your own record. Just keep it in your pocket. So I scribbled something about the other 4 people, so did the other 4 members, and we kept it in our pocket. And for the next 5 days, Monday to Friday, we were all together in the subgroup discussing so many things. We got together. We had coffees and lunches and teas together. We played together. So it was an intensive interaction. In the very last session on Friday evening, the coordinator said, take out the paper that you wrote on Monday morning and evaluate your impression of the other members of your subgroup today as against your first impression. And that impression was so different. The impression that I had of 4 strangers in the first half an hour was so different from the impression I had of the same very 4 people after an intensive interaction of 5 days. So the point is that as leaders, we're expected to judge people, make a judgment of people. And good leaders make mature judgments. They don't jump to conclusions. The reason I'm telling you all this is because Lavanya and I agreed that I'll talk to you about some lessons of leadership that I learned after I passed IAS and joined my career. Let me give you another example, or another lesson that I learned, which is about working with passion. All of us, I'm sure that you also must have been told that the secret to success in life is to discover your passion and pursue it. If you read these self-help books, or if you go to a leadership seminar, you see any leadership talk on YouTube, oftentimes you'll come across this, that the secret to success in your life, in your career, is to discover your passion and follow it. I found that that is not very practical advice. In fact, it doesn't always work that way. Because most of the time, you don't have the luxury or the opportunity of pursuing your passion. Oftentimes, you have to do things that you're not passionate about. So the lesson that I've learned is that what matters is not whether you're pursuing your passion or not. What really matters for happiness in life and for success in your career is whether you're doing whatever you're expected to do with passion. Let me tell you a story to illustrate what I'm saying. You people may not have heard of him, but in the mid-1980s in Andhra Pradesh, we had a Chief Minister, NTR. He was a movie actor, cinema actor, and then became the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh. And NTR was a teetotaler. He didn't drink. Not only did he not drink, but he was disapproving of people who drank. He thought that poor people in the state and around the country have become slaves to drinking. Men work, earn, they drink all their money away. They don't give any money for their families, come and beat their wife, beat their children, and families are crumbling, livelihoods are perishing because of drinking. So he wanted to impose prohibition. He discussed with us, I was in the finance department at that time, and all of us ganged up on him and said, no, sir, you can't do that. Why? Why can't I do that? Sir, because revenue from liquor, sale of liquor, is the second highest source of revenue for the state. We just can't afford to lose that sort of revenue. And if you give that up, we cannot implement all the other welfare schemes that you promised in your election manifesto. I don't think NTR believed us. He said, how about Gujarat? Gujarat has been having prohibition for the last 3-4 decades. They've not lost revenue. So again, all of us civil servants, we're clever now. So Gujarat has had time to adjust. We can't do it now, especially after you made all those populist, we didn't say populist, but all those promises which will cost enormous amount of money. So you can't have prohibition and also implement all your welfare schemes. I don't think NTR believed us. Secretly, I think he believed that Gujarat's relative prosperity was possibly because of prohibition. Of course, that's not part of my story. I'm just telling you that as an aside. But anyway, NTR said, okay, if I can't impose prohibition, I at least want to make sure that poor people don't drink adulterated liquor. A lot of them are, a lot of these sellers of liquor are adulterating with hooch, etc. So I want to make sure that the liquor that they get is clean, supplied from the government. So he said we must set up bottling plants. Bottling plants, country liquor is called arak here. I don't know what it's called in Rajasthan or wherever you come from, but in Andhra we call it arak. So he said we will set up arak bottling plants in every district of the state. There were about 23 districts in the combined state of Andhra Pradesh at that time. And he also decided that those bottling plants have to be set up in 9 months' time, have to be set up, commissioned, and running so that by the next year, he will only supply government clean liquor to people. So government took a decision and they appointed me as the special officer for implementing that arak bottling scheme. My immediate reaction was, why me? There are 250 IAS officers in the state. You could have picked on any one of them. Why did the government pick on me? I was having a happy job there in industrial promotion at that time. The government probably thought I was having too much of a good time. They posted me there. But I was very cut up. I did not show any flair for field work like that, nor did I show any flair for setting up bottling plants. And I also knew that this is a no-end job. It wasn't going to be, It was set up for failure. It is difficult, almost impossible, to set up bottling plants in 10 months, especially following all the rules and regulations of the government. This is not the private sector, this is the government. And my frustration was also that, look, you joined the IAS, you worked so hard, you joined the IAS, you thought you'd do great things, change the world, do public service. And here you are setting a bottling plant. You go to a wedding, you go to a family meeting, and people say, what are you doing now? So I'm setting up liquor bottling plants. It's so embarrassing. So for the first 1 week, I was so frustrated. I was so let down. I was brooding. And I didn't do anything. And the clock was ticking. I already lost 1 week. Next week, I picked myself up and I said, look, if this is what I have to do, I'm going to do it regardless of what. And you know what? Within 2 weeks, I put together a team of people. I got an office premises for us. We started from the scratch, as it were. There was no facilities, no office, no structures, no paper, no nothing. The government just posted me and let me loose like that. So I built an office, I built a structure. We worked like we were preparing for war. It's not a regular office that you normally see. It's just an open office. I was there and there was about 7 or 8 people. We worked day and night. And within 9 months, actually 2 weeks ahead of the schedule, we set up bottling plants in every district of the state, fully staffed, all systems in place, fully commissioned, and everything ready to go. And even today, after 40 years, when I look back on my career, I look back on this assignment for 1 year as one of the most exciting and most rewarding assignment that I had, because not only did I enjoy it, but I learned a lot in the process of setting up this bottling plants. So the lesson I drew from that experience is that it's okay if you have the opportunity to discover your passion and pursue it, do it. If music is your passion, follow music. If writing is your passion, do that. But if any time in your career, you have to do things, and you certainly will have to do things, this I can guarantee you. Do whatever you have to do with passion. That's the second lesson I learned in my career. I have lots of lessons. In fact, I'm now writing them down, but I will stop here and I will take your questions.
Thank you for that amazing set of lessons for us, sir. I think all of us would definitely take that back with us when at the end of the talk today. We have so much to ask you, so let's just dive right into the questions that we had for you. The first question is something which a lot of people wanted to ask you from our college, and I believe other colleges as well. It is very common among engineering students to enter other fields which might be totally unrelated to their engineering branch. You also did something similar by first joining the administrative service after studying physics from an IIT and then eventually moving to economics and now economics academia. What caused such large shifts in your career paths? Was it something you had planned during your undergraduate days?
This is not the first time I've answered this question. People have asked me several times. And if you people think that when I was like you, 20 years old, I sat down and actually plotted my career, I'm going to join the IA, this is what I'm going to do, then I'm going to the World Bank, then I'm going to pick up a PhD in economics, then I will go to I'll become finance secretary and retire as the governor, you're completely mistaken. With the benefit of hindsight, it might look like it was carefully planned. But when I was 20 years old, like all of you, I was as flustered, as bewildered, as confused as any of you. It is true that, like most of you, you have a broad career ambition. I did too. I wanted to write the IAS. But I had a handicap in the sense that I did not know any IAS officer. I had not met any IAS officer. before I decided to write the IAS, because my father has been telling me write the IAS, so I thought I'd do that. I'll give it a chance. And I thought I'll work hard for it. But I had no way of measuring if I would succeed. Like if you're in a class, in your pitch Pilani, typically in a class of 30, that's a closed loop system. You know the other 30 people, so you can measure yourself against them. You know whether you're on the top or in the average or at the bottom, relative to the group of 30 people. But the IAS is an open exam. And I had no benchmark because I'd never met anybody. So I didn't know what the competition was like. And in the early 70s, most of the people who wrote the IAS were studying history, politics, economics. So people told me that if you want to write the IAS, you've got to study one of the subjects. But I wasn't. I wanted to study physics. So I took a lottery and I said, I'm going to study physics and I'm going to see the IAS. I passed the JEE. I went for the IIT counseling and I went to IIT Kharagpur, joined BSc Honours. I opted for physics honours. Then I went to IIT Kanpur, did MSc, and then I passed the IAS. After a couple of years in the IAS, I thought, I should study economics. And the earlier I studied, the better. I applied to some US universities, got admission. I studied economics first at Ohio State University. Then I went to MIT. I actually wrote up a thesis, a part of my master's thesis. I wanted to earn a PhD but for some personal compulsions, I had to return to India. And for the next 15 years, I could not complete that PhD. But eventually, I registered in Andhra University, got a PhD, then I went to the World Bank and all that career progression, So the point I want to make is that it is not as if I plotted this. But yes, I was fortunate that I had an opportunity to specialize in public finance, and I was at the right place at the right time. So it worked for me, but it'll work for you. What you should probably draw from my experience is that as much as you have broad goals, you should have broad goals. You should know what you want to do, but also be flexible. And you can't say I'm going to be governor RBI. I don't think Prime Minister Modi, when he was 20, decided that he's going to be Prime Minister. Okay? So you should have a broad idea. It's like a trend graph. You know what a trend is, but the variation around the trend is going to be there. And I also don't want you to get the impression that my career was a monotonic secular success. I went from one success to another. I had my own share of failures. I had my ups and downs. So in any career, no matter how successful, you're going to have setbacks. And the secret to success is to learn from those setbacks and move on. Thank you.
As I said, I think this was one of the most relevant answers which we all were seeking, and thank you for that, sir. Our next question is a little bit more related with your career as an Indian Administrative Service Officer. You had been involved with the Ministry of Finance both before and after liberalization. From a macroeconomic and administrative perspective, what was the difference in terms of the challenges and opportunities between pre and post liberalization India's?
Pre and post liberalization India. Okay. For all of you who are 20, and maybe even some of your parents who might be relatively young, and some of your professors, it's difficult for you people to imagine the lack of choice and the scarcity in pre-reform India. Let me give you some examples. At that time, if you traveled abroad as I did, I told you I went to Ohio State University when I was 27 or 28. You got $20 of foreign exchange. And if you wanted a telephone connection, these days telephone companies are after us to get telephone connections. Those days, if you wanted a telephone connection, a landline connection, we had only landlines at that time, or an LPG cylinder, these days the dealers are after us to get buy LPG cylinder connections. It took years for us. We had to go to MLAs, etc., get recommendation, get a telephone, or get an LPG connection. We had 3 brands of soap and 2 brands of shampoo to choose from. Today, you go to a grocery or supermarket, you're overwhelmed by the choice you have of soaps and shampoos and all the cosmetics. We had just 3 brands of soap and 2 brands of shampoo. People who used to travel abroad, they used to smuggle low-end tape recorders and low-end cameras. At the airport, you used to see long queues of people at the customs people opening our suitcases and taking out these cheap cameras that we used to bring from Singapore. And color TV, take color TV for granted. In pre-reform India, to get a color TV, you had to have a permit. Only rich people could get a permit because only they could manage the government. And if you want Vespa scooter or a Premier Padmini car, you booked it and kept that receipt. And people actually gave those receipts as dowry. That is the scarcity and lack of choice we had in pre-reform India. And what the reforms did was actually, the reason I'm able to speak about it is because I wrote about it when they had 30 years of reforms 3 months ago. They were celebrating. I wrote about it to the Economic Times, so I'm able to recall this. What the economic reforms did was 3 things. First, pre-reform was a system of government controls and regulations, license, permit, Raj. Government decided what to produce, where to produce, how to produce, how much to produce. Government decided where to sell, what to sell, how much to sell, for how much to sell. Everything was controlled. And why? Because the logic was that if we let the private enterprise reign, if we let people produce what they want, people will waste resources. As one minister at that time said, people produce lipstick. Okay, so they wanted to conserve resources, and the idea was that the way of doing that was that the government must run a tight control on production, every detailed aspect of production. The second dimension of pre-reform India was a complete, lack of confidence, or that foreign investment and foreign trade are defeating, and that for our own purpose, we must produce everything that we want. We must invest whatever we need ourselves. Foreign trade and foreign investment will harm our economy in the long term. The third dimension of pre-reform India was enormous trust and confidence in the public sector, in the belief that the private sector, driven entirely by profit, will undermine the larger public interest. So these 3 dimensions defined pre-reform India. And so when in 1991, when we had the Blitzkrieg reforms, it was an explosion of entrepreneurism. And a lot of investment took place. People enjoyed that freedom. And for the last 30 years, we've seen the evolution of reforms. We've seen entrepreneurship, we've seen investment, we've seen trade, foreign investment, our economy opening up, etc. But one thing I want to say, the last thing I want to say on this is that as much as government controls have been withdrawn or have been minimized, both from Delhi and from state capitals, there is still a lot of management of the government that investors and entrepreneurs have to do at the ground level, at the operational level, in buying land, getting permits, getting labor permit, fire permit, getting electricity connection. I'm not saying it's all corruption. There is a lot of corruption, of course, but there's a lot of indifference, lethargy, venality, lack of accountability. So as much as the license permit Raj has been dismantled, there is still a lot of government interface, which is imposing enormous transaction costs on potential investors and entrepreneurs. Thank you.
I think that sounds like we have made quite a lot of progress, but then there is still a lot of long road to go. Our next question is one of the most popular questions which people would want to ask you. You had spent just the first few days in your tenure when the Lehman crisis happened in mid-September 2008. It must have been difficult for you because you had just joined and you probably never got a proper chance to know your colleagues and build a strong professional relationship with them. Could you shed some light on those times, trying to keep India afloat economically while getting the most positive work done as a leader?
Yeah, thank you, Srijan. This is another story I've told several times. In fact, it's an important part of the book that I wrote. So please allow me 5 minutes to tell the story of my first few weeks at the Reserve Bank of India. You know, I was appointed governor of the Reserve Bank of India back in 2008. On the 5th of September 2008, many of you must have been in junior school, the junior high school at that time. Okay. Now, 5th of September 2008 is a very significant date because on the 7th of September, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collapsed. On the 8th of September, Countrywide went down. On the 10th of September, AIG came to the brink of a meltdown. On the 11th of September, Merrill Lynch vanished. On the 13th of September, Countrywide, a bank, went down. And on the 16th of September, Lehman Brothers collapsed and plunged the global financial system into a crisis that you referred to, Srijan, which Ben Bernanke said is the deepest and the most extensive since the Great Depression. All of us went through another crisis last year in the wake of the pandemic, but this was a different crisis. The fear here was different. The fear at that time was different. Okay. The global economy went into was a near-death experience. It was hurtling towards depression. Everybody was concerned, fear, panic, anxiety. Every country in the world was affected. So was India. And this happened 11 days, just 11 days after I took charge as the governor of the RBI. But in India, there was dismay, denial, disbelief about why we should be affected by a crisis that was because of some excesses by banks in America and Europe. It's those countries that must be affected. Why should India be affected? But there's lots of reasons why India must be affected. I go on and on about that. But the story going around at that time was that India shouldn't have been affected by the crisis because our banks did not indulge in the subprime lending. Our banks did not indulge in any excesses. They were safe and sound. So this new governor who came, he brought on the crisis. So, you know, I took that in my stride. When people said I brought the crisis, I took that in my stride. So wherever I went in the country, people would ask me, so when would the crisis end? As if I knew. But then I would say, if you people said that I brought on the crisis will end when my term will end. And for good measure, I used to tell them when my term would end. But here's the thing. The week after I left the RBI, the crisis ended. 5 years I was in the RBI. Every week was one crisis or another. And the week after I left, the rupee stabilized, growth started going up, inflation started coming down, economy was on a trend path, etc., etc. Crisis finished. So it was, if there's one prophecy, I wish I was wrong on, that was it, but that was not my lot. Really, baptism by fire for me at that time. We had to do a lot of things in those first few days, few weeks, and few months, essentially to see that our markets were functioning and that credit flowed to productive sectors. But I don't want to go into all those challenges. There's one challenge alone that I want to talk about, which is that I had no credibility. As I told you, I was just 11 days in the Reserve Bank when the crisis erupted. I was finance secretary in Delhi the day before. I flew to Mumbai and became the governor. And the financial markets, people, financial sector personnel, nobody knew me. I was an unknown in Delhi. And within 24 hours, I was still an unknown, but I was a known unknown. But for the governor, you can't be a known unknown. You have to be a known person because the markets have to measure you. and you communicate with the markets, they have to understand you. So the markets are trying to understand your spoken language, your body language, the way you twitch, the way your gestures, your personality, your style, your stance. That takes about 6 months. In my case, that time was not allowed, with the result that everybody in the financial markets was nervous about this new guy who came into the RBI. Can he manage the crisis? So if people don't have confidence in you, even if you're doing the right things, those right things will not have the right impact just because people do not have the confidence. That was my first handicap. As if that was not enough, my credibility also was lacking for another reason, which was that the RBI, as all of you know, is expected to be an independent institution. The governor is expected to function independently of the government, take a decision based on his own judgment, of course, consult people, but ultimately take a call on his own judgment, not succumb to whatever the government is saying. Most governments, not just in India, but everywhere, including in the US, resent this independence of central banks. So the story going around was that the government sent me, because I was their finance secretary, so that I was be malleable. I would listen to the government and implement in the Reserve Bank whatever are the government's instructions. So my credibility was low. To add fire to that, further fuel to that fire, the crisis required that I consult frequently with the government. Now, everywhere around the world, during the crisis, central banks and governments were working together. And we had to work together even in India. So that synergy was required. But in India, the story was, if I spoke to the finance minister on the phone now, I was going to Delhi quite often, perhaps twice a week during those early months of the crisis, is to say, oh, we said this, no, this governor is going to take instructions from the government. She is going to Delhi. Actually, the crisis required that we act in close coordination with the government. That was the second dent on my credibility. And further pressure was that even my own staff in the Reserve Bank were unsure about me. Forget the larger finance markets. Forget the government. If your own staff, if your own colleagues, if your own subordinates in your own institution do not have confidence in you, how do you get things done? And the crisis required that I do unconventional things. For example, the inflation was quite high when I took charge. Governor Reddy, the governor before me, actually hiked the interest rate 2 months before he left. So when I took charge and when the crisis erupted, interest rates were quite high. And I told my staff that we must crash interest rate, we must reduce them. And they were all taken aback. What is the governor telling us? Does he know what he's saying? But I knew that the crisis required that we cut interest rates. So I had to earn the confidence of my own staff. I had to earn the confidence of financial markets. And I had to give confidence that I'm my own man. I'm taking a decision on my own judgment, not necessarily succumbing to what the government is saying. And I can't go around and say that, look, I'm independent, I don't take instructions from the government. You don't do that, right? So you have to let your actions speak for you. And it is a matter of enormous satisfaction for me that in the 3 months evaluation and 100 days evaluation of my tenure, as well as in the first annual evaluation of my tenure by the media, they all said that I handled an extraordinary crisis with exemplary confidence and conviction. So those are some of the challenges that I had in the early weeks of my tenure as governor, Srijan.
I think those must have been very, very difficult to overcome. But the fact that you said at the end of your tenure, just a few days later, things were back on track, that proves that the steps you took were indeed right. So definitely congratulations to you on those 5 years. You were able to achieve what you set out to. I think we had a slight hiccup due to some technical glitch here, but I'm pretty sure things are okay right now.
Okay,
Coming
thank
to our next question, if you had the chance right now, what would you have done differently?
you. Again, Srijan, it's about 7 years 8 years actually, since I left the RBI. And over the last 8 years, as you said, I was in Singapore, I was in the US, I was here in India. A lot of people have asked me that question. What would you have done differently? People who ask that question are actually asking with the benefit of hindsight, because they said these developments happened after you left the RBI or after you took that decision. So what would you have done differently? What they're assuming is that had you known what you now know, would you have done differently? Because in real time, when you're taking a decision, you're operating in the universe of knowledge available to you at that time. So if people ask me, what would you have done differently? And if I was going to operate in the same universe of knowledge, I don't believe I would have done anything differently. But if the question is, what would you have done differently if you had known then what you now know? What would you have done? Lots of things are done differently. But let me tell you one thing that I probably would have done differently, and this is an important lesson of leadership, is that I probably would have paid more attention to communication, because communication is an important facet of leadership. All of you as students, as student leaders, your professors, your dean, your director, all of them have to communicate. And communication is an important part of your career trajectory. It's going to be an important part of whatever jobs you do. I would have paid greater attention. Again, let me tell you a story to illustrate the importance of communication. We had taper tantrums in the last few months of my tenure at the RBI. In July, August 2013, we had taper tantrums. Let me not go into the history of taper tantrums, but all I want to tell you is that the exchange rate was crashing, and the RBI was trying to defend the exchange rate at that time. And we did a lot of things, including intervening in the market, instituting capital controls to prevent or arrest the depreciation of the rupee, but quite unsuccessfully. So on July 15, 2013, I remember the date very well, I actually raised the interest rate by 1 percentage point. Okay, that's quite a steep rise. And that was very unusual, because central banks around the world use interest rate as an instrument for managing inflation. They seldom use interest rate as an instrument for managing exchange rate. Even if they did that, they won't admit to it. So here, not only did I raise the interest rate, but we issued a press statement saying that RBI raised the interest rate in order to control or stabilize the exchange rate. That increase in interest rate came at a time when there was a lot of concern about growth in the economy. Growth was also crashing. There was concern that if I raise the interest rate, that will militate against growth. So on the TV that evening, and in the newspapers next morning, and on the social media, there was a lot of discussion about what is this the governor did, raise the interest rate. However, is it not going to hurt growth? So I followed that discussion, and there was a media conference the following morning at about 11 o'clock, and I knew that they will ask me this question. I was prepared for it. Sure enough, as soon as I walked into the media conference room, the first question they asked me was, Governor, you raised the interest rate yesterday, but is that not going to hurt growth? And I was prepared. I said, yes, we are aware of that. We're sensitive to growth concerns. But we have to do this in order to arrest the fall of the rupee. So we will not keep it going for more than necessary. As soon as the rupee stabilizes, we're going to withdraw this measure. I said the right thing, right? I said exactly what was in the statement that previous evening. I said exactly what TV commentators and newspapers editorials wrote. And I thought that calmed the market. Completely wrong. The market crashed. Within 3 hours after my statement of that answer, the rupee dived by 5% in 3 hours. Market was unforgiving of that statement. I was completely flustered. I said exactly what the markets, I believe, wanted to hear. I said the same thing that was in the statement issued by the RBI. I said the same thing that editors and newspaper commentators and TV commentators said. What mistake did I do? So I huddled with my senior staff and I said, what went wrong? And they said two things. They said, first, you sounded, what the market wanted to hear was that the Reserve Bank was focused with undivided attention on controlling the exchange rate. Instead of that, you muddled the communication by saying, yeah, I'm concerned about growth, I'm concerned about inflation, I'm concerned about credit, I'm concerned also about the exchange rate. You muffled the communication, the message didn't get across. The second thing they said was that you sounded very apologetic about what you did, where your shoulders were drooping, whereas they wanted you to look confident about what you did. Here you were looking diffident, doubtful, which did not inspire the confidence of the markets. So I said, what should I have said? So afterwards, of course, some other people, friends told me, instead of saying that, look, we will withdraw this once the rupee stabilizes, you should have said, we will not withdraw this until the rupee stabilizes. And that is a more assertive, more confident statement. And somebody wrote an editorial saying that the governor is not an alpha male. You know what's an alpha male? I didn't know what an alpha male was, so I Googled. And even today, I'm not sure whether being an alpha male or not being an alpha male is a badge of honor or is something to be embarrassed about. But anyway, the editorial said that the governor is not an alpha male. So the lesson of this long story is that communication is very important and you must pay attention not only to what you say, but how you say, in what context you say, and with what confidence you say. Thank you. No, I can't hear you, Srijan. I think you're on mute.
Yes. Yeah, I think now I'm unmuted. Yeah, I think that is another very, very important leadership lesson for all of us in the form of that insightful story that you said. We'll move on to our last question for the interest of time now. And this is among the most popular questions people want to ask everyone who has an idea about India's economy. India has set a very ambitious aim of becoming a $5 trillion economy by the year 2025. But of course, we have been one of the worst hit economies due to the pandemic. Do you believe that at this point the goal is achievable? And do you think that the $5 trillion economy is the one goal we should be chasing, even after such a noticeably negative impact on income inequality in India in the past 1.5 or 2 years?
Srijan, I think I lost you for part of that question, but I got the general gist. Should I answer now? Yeah, okay. I lost you for part of that
I think
question.
there was some technical glitch here.
Yeah, that's fine.
If you understood enough, you can definitely answer.
Sure.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, thank you. There's no need
I'll
to
just
repeat.
repeat
I
the
got
question for the audience.
I got the general drift of that question, which is about the
Okay,
5 trillion economy. You know, when Prime Minister Modi, after re-election, said that set a goal that India should be a 5 trillion economy, it looked quite unrealistic or difficult to achieve at that time. It looks even more improbable now. Today, our GDP about, I think, $2.6 to $2.7 trillion. So if you want to be 5 trillion by 2025, in about 3 years from now, we should be growing what? At about 20% per year in real terms, which is almost impossible. So, okay. So, of course, we will get to 5 trillion sometime. And your second part of your question was that whether we should be focusing on growth or on inequality, or your doubt or your conjecture was that if we focus on growth, will inequality widen? Shouldn't we be focusing on inequality directly? You know, inequality is a big problem. And the pandemic has further deepened inequality in the country. In fact, I wrote about that in the Times of India a couple of months ago. Okay. But I believe that you can't solve the problem of inequality on a standalone basis. A necessary condition, although not sufficient, but a necessary condition for tackling inequality is growth. We need growth. We need to grow the pie in order to distribute. So the goal for India should be to accelerate the growth rate, number one, and number two, make sure that the benefits of growth are widely shared so that people in low-income segments have benefited from that growth. And here's the economics of this. The way I see this is as follows, that if we do not tackle inequality, India cannot grow. Because you know the drivers of growth in any economy from the GDP equation, identity, you know that growth comes from consumption, private consumption and government consumption, and from investment and net exports. So in India, consumption, private consumption has been an important driver of our growth. Now, who is going to consume? If the incomes of the higher income people go up, they're not going to spend that money, they're going to save that money because their consumption needs are met. Our consumption will go up only if incomes of the bottom segments of the population go up. And we should therefore be focusing on ensuring that the incomes of the bottom segments of the population, low income segments of the population go up, which is to tackle inequality. So I would say that tackling inequality is a necessary condition for growth. Okay. So I would not see the dichotomy between growth and inequality like you do. I think both of them are two sides of the same coin. We should be addressing them together, and India's growth will depend very critically on how successfully and how effectively we tackle inequality. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, sir. We still have so much to ask you, but for the interest of time, I think that is all we have time for today. Thank you for sparing your time for this talk. It was absolutely wonderful having you with us. And I believe all of us took a lot of lessons, not just leadership lessons, but a lot of other lessons from this talk today. Thank you from the side of BITS Pilani for gracing this talk.
Thank you, Srijan, and all the very best to all of you. Thank you.